Welcome to this Fane online event. I'm Curtis Sittenfeld. I'm delighted to be in conversation with Essie Chambers. Essie Chambers is an author and award-winning independent producer. She earned her MFA in creative writing from Columbia University and has received fellowships from MacDowell, Vermont Studio Center, and Baldwin for the Arts. Previously, she worked as a television executive and she was a producer on the Oscar shortlist documentary Descendant, which was released by the Obama's Higher Ground production company and Netflix in 2022. Swift River is her debut novel. And it's a novel I love.
Thank you
Congratulations,
so much.
Essie.
I'm so happy to be
I'm
talking
so
to you.
happy. Okay, so we'll get started. I know you'll be reading like a brief excerpt, but just to sort of give an overview, how do you describe the book in your own words to people?
So the way I describe it, it is like a coming of age story wrapped inside this sort of sweeping family saga. And it is centered around a 16-year-old girl named Diamond Newbury who is struggling with what it means to be the only person of color in this all-white, very poor, crumbling New England mill town. It starts in the summer of 1987. I'm obsessed with the 80s, as I'll get to later, I'm sure. And Diamond is living with her very troubled mother. They live a pretty isolated life and stand out for all the ways that they're different. Diamond is biracial. Her mom is white and her dad is black. She's teased relentlessly about her weight. Neither one of them drives, so they hitchhike everywhere they go. And ever since Diamond's dad disappeared 7 years prior, she is the only Black person in this entire town, as I said before. So in the course of this book, she hears from a relative that she's never met on her dad's side, and it starts this correspondence that changes the course of her life. And she discovers that her family has secrets, this town has a hidden history, and she has this really powerful ancestral legacy. And in that way, it really is about the ways that history and place have a really profound impact on our lives.
Yeah, whether or not we know it.
Whether or not we know exactly.
Do you want to read like a little bit to give the flavor?
Yeah, I'm just going to read a tiny bit of the flavor from the prologue. Um, And I should say, so the book is written from the perspective of a 16-year-old Diamond, and then also from a young Diamond, like a 9-year-old Diamond. And in a sense, the prologue is sort of the younger perspective describing what has happened to her father. Okay. Picture my pop's sneakers, worn out and mud-caked from gardening, neatly positioned on the riverbank where the grass meets the sand. This is the place where the Swift River is at its widest and deepest, where a jungly mix of trees makes you feel like you're all alone in the wild somewhere, even though the road is so close you can hear cars humming on the other side. This is the place where we'd come on hot summer nights, the one spot where we could splash around freely without people staring at our black, white, and brown parts. Ma even swam naked sometimes, her pale body like a light trail moving through the dark water. Pop couldn't swim. He'd stand hip deep, hold me high in the air, and launch me out from his arms like a cannonball. Over and over again, I'd paddle back, his proud fluorescent smile my beacon. July 1st. The current is extra strong and the water is churning, restless, as my grandma Sylvie would say, from summer rains. Pop leaves early that morning, long before Ma and me are out of bed. He forgets to make me breakfast before he goes. He leaves the car in the driveway. When Ma comes downstairs, she frowns at the door, wrestling with something on the other side of it. She moves to the window and beams her worried look out into the distance. I decide not to put sugar on my cereal, even though no one's paying attention. Answers come to questions I don't ask. There isn't enough gas in the car for both her and Pop. She has to get to her job, and he has to go find one. He must be off on foot somewhere. 2 days later, his shoes turn up. Tucked inside them, his wallet and house keys. Pop is gone.
Thank you so much. I feel like I think I've read that introduction. many times, and I still am struck by, just like it's so evocative. And I think to myself, even hearing it, I think like, what happens next?
Good, good.
No. Um, okay, so obviously we'll discuss the world of the book much more, but just to get a little sense of how you came to be the person who wrote this. Were you sort of born a writer? What kind of child were you? And then like what was your family like growing up? Where did you grow up? All of that.
I love family questions. I'll start with my parents because I'm very proud of them. My parents were activists. I'm the child of two people who met during the American Civil Rights Movement. And so they went on to become educators and then later social workers. But our house was just bursting with books and ideas, and reading was so central, and storytelling was so central to our lives as a family, and as was social and racial justice fighting. They taught us from a very early age that how essential it was to be of service to your community. And I would say the irony of that is probably our relationship as a family to our community in this town. I think I always like to say we're sort of like the ultimate insider outsiders. Um, we were a multiracial family. My mom is white. My dad who passed. He was black, and we had lots of friends. We had a community, but at the same time, we were still isolated by our otherness, our outsiderness, and experienced kind of very particular kinds of racism. And a lot of that I was able to channel into the book. Obviously, it's a fictional book; it's not autofiction, but that feeling of being never quite a part of the place is really essential to how I think about my own growing up and how I think about Diamond's journey. Um, and I guess how did I, becoming a writer, I think because of the role that reading played in our house and storytelling played in our house, and being an outsider. I mean, I think as so many outsiders will also say, like, reading was a way to escape and to feel like you could disappear into a world. And I don't know, I just always had a kind of, I had the imagination. I was writing poetry. I was telling stories to anyone who would listen, and I had parents who encouraged, both me and my siblings to be artists. I mean, I don't have that sad story of like, someone was trying to talk me into being a lawyer or whatever. They really supported us as artists in whatever we wanted to do. So I I really started at a very young age knowing that I wanted to tell stories, but not knowing exactly what shape that would take.
And I guess we'll get back to this too, but it's taken a few different shapes in your career.
Yeah,
And just to sort of be geographically specific, you grew up in Western Massachusetts
I
in
did. Yes.
the US. Okay, so um, the book has these different strands, different timelines. I guess first, will you maybe give an overview and then talk about what came first, not necessarily like in the chronology. I guess what came first, like in the writing, maybe.
Yeah, sure, sure. Yeah, so the different time periods. So Diamond as a 16-year-old girl, that frame story is set in 1987. And that is actually where I began writing. I thought I was telling a coming of age story. And the heart of the story, the question was, is Diamond going to leave this town it's so painful for all these different reasons? Is she going to stay or is she going to go? And I think the layers of the story were added, these other different time periods and these characters, as I figured out what Diamond needed and what the story needed. And I think the first thing being, I wanted, she needed to be running towards something. There needed to be something hopeful. And so I added another character. This is her aunt Lena, who's the relative of her father that she's never met. And through this aunt, she gets the aunt gives her these letters from an ancestor in 1915, and that layer of the story came from some research that I've been doing. I can talk about afterward, but I would say that was the final layer that came, the 1915 layer.
Talk about it now. Talk about the research now.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so when I was thinking about, well, the first thing I should mention is, so the other there's a flashback that goes back to 1980. So when Diamond is 9 years old, and that actually had originally been, I'd written that as a perspective of the father, and I realized that I didn't. This was a book about women, and it was their voices, and he was better off sort of haunting the story. So the flashback, so I gave that story that voice back to Diamond as a young child. So she is telling the story in 1980 of the final year before her father disappeared. So she's kind of describing from that young person's through a young person's perspective what it's like to watch your parents sort of unravel. And so that's the other time period. And then when I was looking around for a family history for the father, I wanted to root it in real history. And I started looking into whether or not there were Black communities in rural New England in the early 20th century. And I really wasn't coming up with much. I found a book called Sundown Towns, A Hidden Dimension of American Racism. And that sort of, blew my head open and really, blew the book wide open, just to explain what sundown towns are. So sundown towns are essentially, historically, going back to, I would say, the late 1800s, all white towns by design. They were created by either racist laws and ordinances or threats of violence or actual violence and terrorism and murder, where Black and other marginalized communities were driven out of these places. I had always associated them with the American South. I think a lot of us are probably familiar with that narrative, from literature and movies. But what I came to understand in this book is that this phenomenon, these sundown towns, was primarily a Northern American thing, and was in part in response to the Great Migration of Black Americans who were leaving the South to escape the horrific conditions after the Civil War. And so the name of the sundown town name comes from the practice of these communities would often put a sign, sometimes next to the welcome sign of the town, where that would say essentially, Black people, you can pass through during the day, but if you are caught after the sun sets, you will be hurt or killed. And so, again, I discovered that thousands of these towns were created between 1890 and the 1960s. And I sort of instantly made the choice that I was going to make Swift River a former sundown town. And when I discovered also that sometimes exceptions were made for some Black people who were serving some kind of essential function, like, they were domestics or, blacksmiths, or something that they were being useful to the white community in the town, and they would be one or two would be allowed to stay. And so I decided that I was going to make Diamond descended from the one young girl who was allowed to stay behind after the rest of the Black community was violently chased away, and that became the perspective of Clara, of her Aunt Clara, through these letters. And it gave me an opportunity to both give this history roots and diamond roots in this family, but also to tell two very different stories of being the only one in this same town in these two different periods.
One thing that it's interesting to hear you talk about, I mean, like one sort of your parents as activists, and obviously this is very grounded in history. Did you feel conscious at all? Because I think that it feels like such a character-driven book. And did you, um, like obviously sometimes if there's some explicit message or lesson, people tend to write nonfiction. Did you kind of feel conscious of like making the weight of the story land on the fiction, the characters, as opposed to on the history? Because again, it's something that it's so elegantly done, and it feels like such a personal story in all the timelines. And so, is that something that just like happened naturally, or would you be like writing a paragraph and kind of be like, oh, the tone is a little historical or didactic or something here, and then you'd pull back?
Um, I think it's the latter. I mean, I researched this to death. I mean, because I wanted every period detail to be right, but I also didn't intend for this to be historical fiction. I just wanted to make sure that it was grounded in something real that people. I mean, this is that many people don't know about.
Yeah.
But I think that there were moments when it's a very complicated thing to explain, um, both what happened and it's a character, Diamond, who basically doesn't know anything about. She hasn't been taught about American history. She hasn't been taught about family history, and so there's a she's starting from ground one, and so I did not want to be expository. Um, and so I really did have to go through over and over again and say, this is I need to be telling this through the filter of a particular character. And in some instances it was Clara, and some it was Lena. And so yeah, I mean, the characters' voices were very clear in my head, and that took a long time to get to. But I did find myself for sure having to go back and make sure that they were explaining it in the way that only that they could.
Mhm.
I also didn't want to be, I fictionalized this event that happened in Swift River that I won't talk about. I don't want to give too much away, but so I didn't want to be held to any real events. I just wanted the overarching history to be true.
It's interesting, sort of hearing how much research you did, because I do feel like sometimes I'm reading a novel and I'll think like that writer did a ton of research and they almost can't help themselves. Like it's almost like they put so much effort that they need to include it, even though it doesn't serve the plot. Whereas I truly feel like all the research you did, like the novel wears it lightly, you know what I mean? And it only does serve the plot. Okay, this is switching topics slightly. Do you have a favorite character other than Diamond? I mean, I don't even know if Diamond is your favorite, but because she's the main character, she obviously, gets a lot of attention or, sort of speaks a lot. But is there someone else that you had a special fondness for, like was especially fun to write?
That's hard. I mean, it's between Shelley, who is this new friend that she's making. But you know what? I think it's the mother. I think it's Ma. Um, Ma is this. Well, the first thing I'll say about Ma is, I probably shouldn't admit this as a writer, but this mother character, she's a nut. She's crazy. I think you would probably agree. And um, I I did not want my own mother to see herself in this character, so I made her as crazy as possible because my own mother is so incredibly sane. And so I just kept pushing Maud further and further away from the specifics of my own mother, so that just in my own head they would never be confused and my mother would never be confused. And then I think the kind of crazier that she got, the more that I challenged myself to make her an incredibly flawed parent who fiercely loved her child and was failing her profoundly, and and have that happen in ways that could be painful to read, but also funny.
Mhm.
I really think that a lot of I didn't set out saying every scene has to be funny, but I think that just organically because of the characters, the Diamond and Ma stuff, because it's, you know, you have your typical teenager struggling with this mother who is hugging her too tightly and sort of, you know, suffocating her with love. That their interactions are funny. They're fun to write anyway. Um, and so I think that balance, and I just think it's sort of like, yeah, it's the balance of this very flawed person who I wanted people to still have empathy for. And I get a lot
Oh,
of
I
people.
definitely I find Ma very, very endearing. And I also I mean I found the book often very funny. And I think that you know, based on a description or based on Diamond feeling like such an outsider at such a kind of vulnerable point in her life, you know, it can feel like it might be very bleak, and there are these bleak moments, but then there's this real appreciation for like the absurdity of life, or like the ridiculousness of being a person, or like our sort of our like inconvenient yearnings or whatever. And did you have a sort of like, do you have a kind of guiding principle in terms of how you handle humor? Like, is writing stuff that's funny different from kind of getting a character through a scene more straightforwardly, or is it the same?
I mean, coming from you are my favorite writer of comedy. So coming from, I almost want to ask you that question.
Essie.
It's the truth. Oh my goodness. I mean, effortlessly in a way. I mean, it just so I won't
I'm so
embarrass
glad I set us both up for
you
this.
for that compliment. Yeah. I It's such a great question because I would say I did understand that this character was carrying a lot of painful things, and as such there would have to be lightness in the book, and it would have to feel hopeful and delightful to read, while there was still also pain. And I think I think her filter is a comedic filter, and I challenged myself. I've talked about this before. I have these two post-its that I'm staring at. One says "Tell the truth," and the other says "Make yourself laugh." And that's always my filter as a writer. I like dark and funny. I like dark and light together. I feel like that is life. That's the way that we experience life. And I find that it doesn't. I'd be curious to hear how you do this, but it doesn't work when I try to be funny or I write jokey based scenes. I know that in making, you know, I know what's going to happen in a scene, and I often might think about what will humor myself. Like I go back to like what would I laugh at? What are the specifics? I find the humor in like really weird, odd specifics. Uh,
Mhm.
but I think the effort does not, like, I'm not setting up a joke and then a punchline. You know, I come from television. I know how that formula works, and it just would not work in this kind of a story. Or it has to come from character. And so I think much of the work was in creating a voice that could carry humor organically without it feeling like she was the fat girl making jokes through life,
Right,
to
right, right.
distract
But
people from her fat girl, because that's such a, you know, that's such a trope. I didn't want to fall into that.
it's interesting because actually a lot of her of Diamond's humor is in some ways interior or internal. Like it's almost like
Yeah,
she's cracking jokes with herself.
yeah, yeah,
Um, which I wonder if that's like uh like a way of counterbalancing. She's not doing it to amuse other people.
absolutely.
You mentioned, you know, you had this sort of distinguished career in TV and film, and sort of not borrowing the like punchline humor. Like, are there things that you did borrow, or like do you think you were influenced from in film or TV in terms of, I don't know if it would be like you know, imagery or structure, or like, can you see clear lines between how storytelling works in those categories and how it works in a novel.
Yeah. The first place I go to when I hear that question, the first place I go to. So I spent the more recent thing that I did in my career is I produced documentaries. But really, the thing that I spent the most time doing, I worked as a development executive in film and television, and what that meant was I was sort of like at the part in the television and film production process where you are like, baking ideas in an oven and throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what works, and it's an intensely creative process where like failure is built into the equation. Not everything you do is going to work. You know that going into it, and it's just a really I don't know. I found the way that I approached everything, particularly from the networks that I was working for, is like, how do I break new ground? How do I find a new way to tell the story So that was always my filter, and I think. And I also I spent some time working for a teen young adult channel in the States called The N. It's part of the Nickelodeon universe. And so I also have such an affinity for telling stories for this particular age. And I think that we spent a lot of time um, perfecting the voice of a teenager, and getting in a way that's respectful and authentic, and that some of that was about tapping into the part of ourselves that remembers being a teen. I mean, I think it's something that just everyone has a visceral response to, is that moment in life. And so I both the process of developing stories and developing stories that were about that moment in life, that really definitely came from my work in television and film. And then I would say, I don't know what came first. I am a very visual writer,
Mm.
and I often will see a scene or an image before I even know what's happening. One of the earliest things that I saw for this novel was an image of Diamond and her mother on the side of a road, and I didn't know that cars were whizzing by them, and I didn't know. Like, just it made me feel protective of them. I felt like they were incredibly vulnerable, and so I began shaping, the story around what I was seeing. So I think that either that was there all along, or that was, enhanced by that experience um, of working in a visual medium for so long. And then I do think that there is a kind of discipline, like a structural discipline, that you learn when you have to tell a story in 30 minutes or an hour or 2 hours, that you internalize, um, that I think just helps me think about a beginning, middle, and end, and pacing, and all that kind of thing. I think I just kind of take, actually, to my own detriment sometimes. I would say that um, when I was first writing this book, every chapter ended as if it was like the end of the book or the end of an episode of television. And so some of the practice was figuring out how to keep, sustain the momentum for an entire novel. So I had to teach myself that.
Well, something you said about that I think is really interesting about development is that, did you say maybe failure is sort of baked in? And
Failure is big. Yeah.
did
We actually had
you?
an equation. Like there was like, if you put, I don't know if it's like this now. I think probably money can't be wasted in the same way. But when I was doing it, it's like, if we do 10 things, 5 will go to pilot and only 1 will work.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah,
And
it's like,
did you have false starts or, dead ends with Swift River? And this is an impossible question to answer that I'll ask anyway. Were you more unfazed than maybe other writers are because you were like, failure is baked in, or that, it's a bumpy road?
no, I was, no. I'm so precious with everything. I mean, I think that was, I don't know that that'll ever leave, but that was definitely part of my journey as a writer, to understand, I had this great teacher in grad school who said, named Deborah Eisenberg. She's a brilliant short story writer, as I'm sure you know who she is. And she said, "What a luxury to have to cut beautifully written prose." And what that said to me is like, yeah, right. It doesn't matter if you've written cutting something doesn't mean that it's written poorly. It means that it's not serving the story or serving the character.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so, like, honing a filter that is, and other people have helped me along the way to keep this in mind, is like, is this moving the story forward or deepening character? And if it's not, it does not belong in this book. And I had to cut massive chunks of the book with that filter in mind, and it was very painful. But what it also did was, you know, I don't know if you have this experience, but like once you cut something unnecessary, it feels like an exhale in a way. Like
Hmm.
you ever have that experience where like you're
Oh
holding
yeah,
on
or to
something?
me it almost feels like decluttering your house. It does,
Yes,
it feels like a relief. Yeah.
yes. And I am a baby hoarder. And so yes, it's sort of like I'm holding on to a
Same.
dress that you are. I didn't know that about you. Yeah.
And
So
you've been in my house.
I have. Oh my God, I had no idea.
You've
No,
only been in parts of it.
well, that is that. Come to my closet. I mean,
I
everything
shielded
falls
you.
down. It is. I call myself like a nostalgia hoarder. It's
Mm.
sort of, and because if it makes me
An
feel something,
intentional hoarder.
intentional hoarder. If I feel something, I don't want to get rid of it. And it
Yeah.
is. It's the writing is. It's very. It's the same thing. And I think as soon as you realize like you're holding onto a dress that looked good on you and whatever, how many decades ago, and doesn't look good on you now. It's a stupid obvious metaphor, but um it is. For me there's always like a sparkle that returns, and it might not be in the first read, but I often, now I'm getting to the weeds, but when I read through my work, if I have a tendency to speed through parts, there are often parts that don't belong
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
book.
yeah.
Almost
You're
always.
like, I'm a little bored, and then it's like, how bored will the reader be? Like, I'm bored and I wrote this. It's like I chose
Exactly.
to put it in. Yeah, no, I definitely have had that experience. I want to get back to you. You mentioned early on in this conversation that you have sort of a particular fondness for the 80s. Why is that?
I, I came of age in the 80s, and they're so complicated in a way that I found so rich and I mean, they were people in America for all sorts of political reasons. Pop, like the hair and the clothes and I just talk about like finding like it's such easy ways to find comedy in the details of the 80s. So I found that to be a rich place for humor. Um, I also found that it was because of the way that we consumed pop culture, this obviously was before the internet and all, et cetera, et cetera. People that you were around, and that really appealed to me, particularly when you're talking about a young girl who had almost no interaction with other Black people apart from the pop culture that
Mhm.
she was consuming. And so it was a way for her to, there are a couple of moments in the book where she talks about Black characters in movies and like that. Those are the Black people that she knows, and
Mhm.
really interesting way to explore this character's relationship to Blackness. Yeah, I just thought it was particularly interesting the way that as a consumer of culture, she could have limited pieces of Blackness. And they were also, at the time, they were the most palatable kinds of Blackness. Like it was the beginning of music videos where it was only Whitney Houston and Michael Jackson, and music was segregated. And it's I just, from a pop culture standpoint, I just thought it was so rich, and there was just a lot that I could do with this girl who's learning who she was as a Black girl at the same time.
I agree completely that it does like it sort of the time her time period Diamond being 16 in 1987 makes it it'll like interesting in this whole other way. Was there ever a moment when you thought that she would be 16 in like 2022 or 2017, or did you always know this was an 80s coming of age
It's
story?
a good question. I feel like I probably started. Is that true? I think I started and then very quickly realized that I wanted her in this particular moment in time. Um,
Because you had this career in film and TV, but then you were working, I think, for several years on a book too. Do you have advice for someone who might be, whether it's an adjacent field or just like an unrelated field, but who thinks like there's a novel inside me that's trying to get out? How do you help that novel like, get be born into the world?
hmm, yeah. Yeah. I mean, this took me a long time to write. As you know, this took me almost 10 years to write. It took me about 9 years to write, which is, I used to be ashamed to admit, but now I'm very proud of all of the different
Wow.
versions of myself that were involved in telling this story. And I think, gosh, my journey as a writer, my advice would be about developing a writing practice, and the way that what I mean by that, I think I tried a lot of things for a long time that other people did that didn't work for me, and they were always around goals, and so I think I'm guessing that someone who's coming to this later in life, it's hard to carve out time, give yourself permission to carve out time, and my goal setting was always like 10 pages, whatever the word count. And I always just let myself down. And I do think that there is a kind of personal integrity that is essential that you build when you were starting out writing, that is about doing what you say you're going to do. And just talking about like the very, even before you got, but just thinking a thing, that a product, or the end
Hmm.
goal as the end goal. And so my goal was like, show up at, for these hours. If I write nothing, if I stare at the computer, eventually I'm going to write something. And what I ended up doing was things that would feed the writing process, whether it was reading or um, I don't know, listening to something that I knew, or researching. Research gave me so
Hmm.
much. Um, I was sort of chasing sparks, and I came to honor that process of chasing sparks as part of writing. And that was born of just showing up for the however many hours a day that I said I would, and not being beholden to a word count as a goal,
Yeah.
if that makes
Oh
sense.
my gosh, it makes so much sense. So it's funny because um, I went to the Iowa Writers Workshop in my early 20s, and the director was Frank Conroy, who would say, I hope I'm quoting him precisely, but it was something along the lines of, it's not the product, it's the process, which I think is a version of like, it's not the destination, it's the journey. But it's like I couldn't
Yes.
agree more. And in my early 20s, I think I was like, it is definitely the product. Like, I want to write a book. I want to get it published.
I can't write this
But,
word. Yeah,
but as
totally.
time has passed,
Yes.
I'm kind of like, oh yeah, like it's my own relationship with the thing I'm writing. And yeah, a friend of mine even recently said something along the lines of like that she had been working on a book that she was trying to answer particular questions with that book. And I was like, oh yeah, totally. Like it's like your relationship with your own mind. And do you during the writing, did you have an ideal reader? Were you like, this is the person that I most want to impress or comfort, or I most want to like reach them with this book, or not really?
I think if I was conscious of a reader, I don't think I was, but I do know that at one point I tuned into the fact that, the diamonds of this world are often not the center of the story, and particularly someone with this constellation of issues. And they're just not humanized in a way. And so I was definitely just so excited at the idea that a diamond might see themselves in this world and feel, seen and respected. That meant a lot to me. And then I would say, since the book has come out, what is also important to me is, I'm hearing a lot. People, I'm getting like the most unbelievable responses from people who are moved and sending me like pictures of photos where there are tears all over the pages of the book, like that. Just really like, or Google Docs of the funniest moments in the book. It just, this one woman said, my life is nothing like Diamonds, nothing like Diamonds, but I really felt like I was in her skin as I was reading the book. And I think in that way, like as an empathy exercise, I really do love the idea of people, of a reader who is maybe connected to some whatever, the outsider in themselves, wanting to hear the story that is about a girl just wanting to belong, just longing for community and connection. And so, and with a weirdo character, like I like that. I like that she's a little bit weird. So I think, you have to have an appreciation for a little bit of an oddball, but for for someone who where those things are important, I think that I knew that I wanted to reach.
And how has your own family reacted to the book? We sort of started talking about your family. There's so much about family and identity in the book. Like what what feedback has your own family given you?
Yeah. Um, so I should start by saying, in the course of writing this book, I lost my younger sister first, which was very painful. But in many ways, she's much funnier than I am. She was also a writer and a photographer, and um, she I think Clara in the book is writing to her sister Sweetie. Those are who the letters are to, and I think I was writing to my sister in many ways, and so that was incredibly cathartic to do, and so I think now she is in the with me, getting a really a kick out of all of this. I also lost my dad a couple of days before I sold the book. He had, I had more of an opportunity to share more of the story with him, but I also think he would be incredibly tickled by this. I think I was able to channel them throughout, but that they are here with me as I try and process everything that's happening in this really beautiful way. Um, and so my mother and my brother, who are very much here with me, and my mom, I was very nervous about my mom reading the book, for all the reasons that I said. I just thought she would like try and see herself somewhere, and she absolutely she read the book twice, and she's probably on her third or fourth time at this point. And one of the last times, she said to me, "I miss Diamond. I have to read the book again." Which to me, there's no better. It's like there's no bigger compliment, you know.
Yeah.
Um, I miss Diamond too, so it's sort of like the idea that yeah, these are living, breathing people that are maybe inspired in some way by our lives, but that both my mother and my brother are able to see as completely separate is like such an achievement for me.
Yeah.
So, and that my dad and my sister, I know, are incredibly proud. I mean, both of them, particularly my father. I don't think that he really ever truly understood what I did in television and film. And I had a great career, but the question that he always asked me is, "Are you writing? Are you tending to your writing? What have you written lately?" And so, oh, he's so happy right now. He's so happy.
Well, I mean, I want to say I'm so sorry for the loss of your sister and of your dad. And I know the book is dedicated to your sister, and there's like a really lovely paragraph in the acknowledgments about her and about, other family members. This is I guess a much kind of related but lighter question. I mean, this has been such a buzzy book. I know there's so much excitement in the UK, excitement in the US. You were on, the Today Show in the US multiple times, which is as big as it gets. It was
Yeah.
a Jenna Bush Hager pick, and your brother was kind of accompanied you to the TV studio visit. Can you talk a little bit about I guess one kind of, like sort of being on the other side of the camera, like, and having this debut novelist buzziness, and then also like your brother going with you. What were those experiences like separately and together?
Oh, you know, it's I was terrified of all of that. Even just without the buzziness part, going from, it's going from writer to author. It's like going from this very private thing to being turned inside out and having um, the whole world have access to this part of you. And even in all the buzziness part and the Today Show knows that it's surreal. I mean, I'm really not, I've not come down from it yet in a way that I can figure out how this fits into my life. And I mean, I feel incredibly lucky to have these kinds of platforms available to me. Um, but I will say, even like with the Today Show appearance that I did, there was a book club present, a real book club who got to ask me questions. And to me, the experience exemplified the bigger experience I had. These people were so excited to be there, and they had such beautiful personal questions to ask about the book. And that has been the greatest surprise to me, has been like sort of the intimacy that I'm able to have with people who are telling me, who are sharing what they love, but also telling me personal things about themselves. Um, and so to experience those kinds of connections over and over and over again inside of all of this buzzy public facing part of the process. It's just I haven't figured out how those two things exactly connect yet, but it's been really interesting to experience both at the same time. And then to have my brother there, I mean, he's like it's like having my anchor. It just felt he's brilliant and charming and wonderful, and also definitely contributed to the book in so many ways. He's incredibly creative. But yeah, I think to be able to look over and see family and someone who is home in the midst of all of this unfamiliar stuff that's happening is just such a comfort. And it was incredible to have him go through it with me. He was on
Well,
TV. He was
I,
on.
I
They loved
know
him so
that, yeah,
much.
the anchors were clearly very
They
tickled by
loved
his
him.
presence. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's a clip that's definitely worth looking for on YouTube. Well, Essie, congratulations.
Thank you
I
so
love Swift River. So many other people I know have already loved it. So many more people are going to continue to love it. But this has been such a like fun, interesting. I mean, you and I have been talking about this book for a few years now, and I feel like there's an infinite amount to say. But
Yeah.
thank you and congratulations.
Thank you for being such a champion of this book. I appreciate you. I appreciate you so much. So thank
It's
you for
my
taking me to
it's
do that.
effortless. It's like how could anyone not be? Okay, thank you, Essie.
Thank you.